I'm Bruce Winston. I'm a professor and researcher with Regent University's School of Business and Leadership. This is a series of videos describing the New Testament-based values, principles, sources, actions, and outcomes that emerged from a three-phase study that we have been working on now for 4 years. Hopefully, this will help inform you of what these values are and how they relate to organizational spirituality. The end result, we hope, will assist you and others to create positive organizations in which there is employee well-being and human flourishing and very successful and productive organizations. The three-phase study began with a series of 22 exegetical researchers who reviewed passages from the New Testament looking for principles that relate to organizational spirituality. These 22 researchers not only use Scripture to support their findings, but also to apply their findings to the workplace. Phase 2 consisted of 12 researchers conducting qualitative studies. Each of the 12 took 1 or 2 chapters from the Phase 1 book and either combined principles where there were duplicates, condensed principles when there were multiple principles that were very similar, or refined the principles so that they might be more carefully aligned with the contemporary literature on organizational behavior. After each qualitative study, the qualitative researchers created scale development items and produced a total of 77 scale development items. Phase 3 required 3 quantitative researchers who had experience with scale development, who then conducted a factor analysis study and found a 39-item factor which generated information about how to measure the underlying concept. While we were looking at the final 39 items, it dawned on me as I was looking at it that there is a great similarity to Rokeach's concepts of instrumental values, values for which we behave, we act, we do something in order to achieve a better end state. Rokeach referred to those end states as terminal values. I also noticed while looking at the 39 items that there seemed to be a connection to the biblical Greek concept of agapao love, which is a virtuous love, doing the right things for the right people, the right time, for the right reasons, which aligns with Aristotle's concept of what a complete friendship is. Aristotle talked a lot about friendship. He also talked a lot about happiness, a concept of eudaimonia, but his concept of happiness was not, let's all have a good time. It was a sense of comfort, a sense of completeness, in which everyone was doing what was good for the individual based on calling and gifts and skills and abilities, but also doing what was good for others so that others may also share in that same sense of their own accomplishment and their own sense of well-being and human flourishing. In this set of values, we're going to be tying them back to the New Testament so that we can understand the base for this that preceded even Aristotle's work. So I hope you'll enjoy all the processes we go through. I'll explain more as we continue. After we concluded this first assignment, this first instrument, I asked Dr. Gilbert to join me, who is also an exegetical researcher but was not part of Phase 1. That kind of provided an extra validity testing for some of the things that came out of the Phase 1 study. He and I values coded the first instrument's items and the underlying instrumental values that we perceived, as well as trying to understand what might be those terminal values. Out of the 39 items, we uncovered 38 terminal values, and I'll explain those as we go through, because this series of videos is really about those terminal values. Now, you may wonder, is this only going to be about organizations? For this video series, yes, that's where my research and teaching lies. Obviously, that's the context I'm going to work from. However, you may also be asking, why just these 39? Aren't there more that could be used? And actually, I thought the same thing. I was surprised that some things like unity did not show up in the values that emerged from the phase 1 and then the phase 2 studies. There probably are quite a few other values. However, the 39 instrumental values that emerged from the phase 2 study completely explain the agapao concept. We could add more, but it's not going to change the concept as long as they are related to that concept. That's obvious. But if we have one that has a higher factor loading, which would include it in the final consolidated scale, which for the first one we reduced the 39 down to 12, and if we have a new one that fits in that 12, in other words, a high enough loading that it removes one of the existing 12, it's still going to measure agapao. So while we may find quite a few more values, it's not going to change the essence of the measurements, nor the essence of the concepts I'm going to present in this study. The second instrument that we produced after Dr. Gilbert and I completed the values coding produced a 16-item factor, which we reduced then to 10 items. And again, the same thing would apply here as I just mentioned about adding new values. If we do add more terminal values to this second instrument, it's still going to measure agape. So we have some comfort in that. We may play around the fringes a bit, and if people are willing and interested in playing on the fringes, great. I certainly hope I have some opportunities to do that as well, simply because there are some values that I think are important, such as unity, for an organization. These series of slides that I'm going to present through the course of these videos are organized by terminal value. I'll present the principles that came out of phase 1. I'll provide a definition that came out of phase 3 when we started looking at the terminal values. I'll also connect the terminal values to the instrumental values that emerged from the phase 2 study that we then understood better in the phase 3 study. And I'll include outcomes where I actually can understand the outcomes. But there are some things that I haven't yet figured out how to describe them, and maybe I'll come up with some ideas as we go through the videos. Otherwise, I'll leave it up to you to determine what outcomes these things. I want to go through and show you the values based on the scriptural passages, just so you can get a sense of that perspective. Phase 1 was done by the biblical passages. And then Dr. Gilbert and I are working on a book that also goes back to the biblical passages. But in this case, I didn't want to have these videos encumbered by the passage as the predominant element in this presentation, but rather to have you focus on each individual terminal value. So you can see here that 5 scale development items and 12 terminal values emerged from 2 passages, John's Gospel, chapter 20, 19 to 29, and John's first letter, chapter 1, verses 1 to 10. 9 scale development items and 10 terminal values came from 1 Corinthians 9, 19 to 27, Paul's letter to the Corinthian church. These are all of the terminal values that emerged: concern for others, trust, mutuality, discernment, biblical morals, belonging, inclusion, voice, positivity, encouragement, love, support, empowerment, others-centered communication, authenticity, practiced, espoused, values, alignment. And from the 1 Corinthians passage, the terminal values are truth, discipleship or development, humility, whole person recognition, and recognition of calling. From Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 16, verses 1 to 16, the terminal values are equality of all people, transparency, collaboration, heart-centered communication. The letter to the Philippians, chapter 1, 1 to 11, 16 to 18, and 2 Timothy 1 brought the terminal values of mission completion, affirmation, and affection. Colossians, chapter 3, 23 and 24 provided the terminal values of responsibility, accountability, commitment, self and other focused motivation. Paul's letter to the Ephesians, chapter 4, 1 to 16, produced the terminal values of development, self and others self-actualization, self-discipline, self-evaluation. Peter's first letter produced the terminal value of care for others, James' letter, chapter 4:13 through chapter 5:12, produced the terminal value of patience. These are all the values in alphabetical order that kind of introduces you to the sequence that I'm going to work through in this series of videos. Look at all these particular terminal values and imagine working in an organization in which everybody is committed to these terminal values and is behaving in ways, instrumental values, that help lead the whole organization to this point. And now think about people who have said the Bible is not relevant to our organizations. This is one of the things that has become so obvious as I've spent quite a few years now studying Scripture and its relevance to management, leadership, and organizational studies. Because we're dealing with organizations, we're dealing with organizational culture. So I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about culture and its companion, climate. According to Shine, culture is a collection of artifacts, behaviors, communications, and meanings. Ying and Ying define culture similarly, but added a bit to the definition. They said that it's a set of beliefs, values, and norms learned and shared by a group of people via their common experiences. These would also tie then to instrumental values. Ying and Ying explained that communication and behaviors can be presented as beliefs and values. So here we tie back to the terminal values. In phase 3 of the New Testament-based organizational spirituality study, we developed the New Testament Organizational Studies Leader Scale, which allows us to measure organizational culture based on observed leader-manager behaviors. That's the first instrument that we produced in phase 3. And as I mentioned, we noticed that the 39 values seem similar to agapao love. Ying and Ying posited that while culture is at a community or organizational level, climate is at the individual level and can be used to measure employees' sense of well-being. This was where we started looking into these underlying terminal values in phase 3. The terminal values are what people experience. They have statements made like, I feel safe, I feel like I belong, this makes me feel like it's home here, I feel wanted. These are all statements where people have a sense of person-organization fit and are comfortable and usually have higher levels of employee work engagement as well as greater organizational commitment and organizational identity. All of these items are demonstrated in the contemporary literature as contributing to employee well-being, employees' human flourishing, organizational performance, and employees' willingness to stay with the organization. As I mentioned, we created a second instrument in phase 3 in which we measured people's sense of these terminal values. Aristotle did a fair amount of work on virtues, and I want to lead you through some of that thinking as we progress through the base before we move on into the specific values. Rokeach described terminal values as end states to which people aspire. The end states may be for oneself or all people. And if you think back at that large slide with the 38 values, those are all things that people aspire to for themselves or for others or for the whole organization. Rokeach went on to describe instrumental values as desired behaviors driven by one's terminal values as both worthy to exhibit because of the goodness of the end state, which connects us into virtue, and these are necessary to achieve and maintain the end state, which are the terminal values. So terminal values, instrumental values are interwoven and cannot be operated or talked about separately. Thus, we might view instrumental values as behavioral evidence of what the actor considers as a good character trait, which is why the first scale we developed in phase 3, where employees commented about what they perceived their organizational leader or manager to be doing. I'm going to stop at this point. That's the introduction, and then the next video will begin working through the individual values. Thank you.